Dr. Todd Chaffee, who's with us, brings excellent credentials, but that's the least that he brings. He has a BA in philosophy, a Master of Divinity, and a PhD in systematic theology. But he also brings amazing tales from the prison system, to quote lyrics of a song, but not just tales of the system, stories of getting involved in what has become a rich prison ministry. And I happen to be in the audience. Maybe one or two of you were 3 or 4 years ago. We had Dr. Chaffee down in the St. Andrews room, and we were moved by what he had to say to us then. In what I learned this morning was really just a embryonic, really, prison ministry, and now it's 3 or 4 years old, and wait to hear what it's doing. So please help me welcome Dr. Todd Chaffee.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I had a great time when I was here last time. And so when I was invited to come back, I said, of course. And it's great to be with you. So yes, several years have passed, and the prison program has grown. And it has grown in ways that we could not anticipate, all for the good. And so we are indeed blessed with this program. During the course of the presentation, if you have a question or a comment, just jump in. All right, just either just start talking, raise a hand, do something. I've been teaching for a number of years, so I've seen and heard it all. So you just go ahead and jump on in. So I'll start here on this first slide, that the Calvin Prison Initiative is a partnership between Calvin University and Calvin Theological Seminary. And so there's a history there that's been developing for well over 10 years, and it resulted now in the CPI, the Calvin Prison Initiative. And this is really interesting. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Christian Reformed Church, Calvin Seminary, Calvin Med College. I don't know what it is. Maybe Dutch people don't always get along real well. But there's been some friction over the years between Calvin Seminary and Calvin College, even though they're kind of on the same campus and institutions. But guess what? Prisoners have been bringing them together. And so this is the first major partnership between these two institutions in a long time, to where we actually share administrations at times, faculty, and students. So this program has been a huge blessing on those two institutions. Well, let me see here. All right. I have to begin by simply asking, have you heard the phrase mass incarceration? Right? And let me ask this, and this is not rhetorical. When you hear the phrase mass incarceration, and if you want to share, in what context do you often hear it? Where do you hear that phrase, mass incarceration?
Well, when you look at certain communities where many of the members are incarcerated.
Okay, so out of those communities, they talk about mass incarceration. Where else might you hear the phrase mass incarceration?
Military?
Military, okay, you might hear it there, military.
Cambodia.
Cambodia. Where else? Mass incarceration.
When they're talking about drug crimes.
Yeah. So quite often in the media, not uncommon to hear a story about drugs, drug crimes, and then incarceration.
So that would be mafia or mobs?
Could be mafia, mob, gangs, all of it.
Myanmar.
Yes?
Urban America.
Urban America is definitely, has now in that narrative of urban America, is the phrase mass incarceration. Now the one place too that I often hear about it is politically. So you'll hear politicians often talk about incarceration issues, prisons, crime, and quite often when we do hear those conversations or those talks from politicians, maybe state officials, that sort of thing, it's usually tinged with fear, right? So in other words, we kind of got to be scared. We got to be worried that there are criminals out there and drugs and whatnot. This phrase is relatively new. It's relatively new in the last several decades. And if you were to say, what does mass incarceration represent? We could just figure it out. Well, mass incarceration. So we're probably talking about more and more incarceration. But if you were to say, no, when does the phrase really get traction, and what does it mean? That maybe we would not know exactly. So I want to take a few minutes and just talk about what do we mean when we say mass incarceration. I'm referencing here Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. If you have not heard of this book, have not read the book, but you find any of this today interesting, I highly recommend that book. That book came out about 10 years ago. Michelle Alexander is a lawyer. She's African American. And she asked the question over 10 years ago, why is it that America's jails and prisons have overly represented people of color? So if you go into your average prison in the United States, the predominant group of people in that prison are going to be of color. Mostly African American men. So at the prison where I work, I would say the prison is about 65% African American male. So her question is simply, why? Why? Well, she's going to argue, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to let you in on the thesis of the book, she's going to argue that today's movement of mass incarceration absolutely has a racial component, and that this racial component could be traced all the way back to slavery, actually. And that today, it's showing itself in our carceral systems as a new form of segregation, thus the Jim Crow. And so that's kind of behind her interest in this question or topic of incarceration. Now, I reference the book just because as a lawyer, she provides tremendous amounts of data and is able to show how incarceration has changed over the years and centuries, and if there are even patterns to who gets incarcerated, why, especially now at the level. And then there's the Pew Research Center. So again, just more data collection on this. Now, let's consider here between the years 1980 and 2016. In that period, incarceration rates went from 300,000 to 2.2 million. So it's a good jump. It could be said, well, there's a lot of people in the U.S. 2.2 million isn't all that bad, is it? Well, it depends, I guess. If you look on average today, there are about 7 million people who are either in a prison, in a jail, on parole, or on probation. So just over 7 million people are connected to the incarceral system. Now to put it in terms that we could easily get, 1 in every 31 adults in the U.S. is somehow under the incarceral system. 1 in 31. So I don't know how many people are here today.
31.
About 31. So I'm not going to ask for a raise of hand. But you know, just to get a sense. So here it is, this nice crowd here, our little group. Likely, one of us has been connected to the incarceral system. And so when you put in those terms, it very much impacts all of us. And so today, it's not uncommon for somebody to know somebody or who knows somebody who has been connected to the incarceral system. To put it in terms that we kind of can get, if you compare the U.S. incarceration rates to other countries like the U.S., and now we're thinking per 100,000 citizens, 2018, here's how it would look. For every 100,000 citizens, Germany incarcerates 77, France 102, England and Wales 142, Russia 415, the U.S. 655, and in 2008, the U.S. incarcerated 1,000 per 100,000. So just a straightforward comparison to these other countries, including Russia, is that the U.S. easily outpaces these other countries in incarceration. Some scholars have looked at it this way. It seems as if the US is almost addicted to incarceration. We incarcerate so many of our citizens at such a quick rate when it comes down to it. Now, when did this start picking up? In the 1970s.
Drugs.
So in the 1970s, moving into the 1980s, we see a huge spike now starting in incarceration rates. Well, what else were we seeing, observing? We were starting to have folks question things like our country and the lack of law and order. That became a very important phrase that was used now by politicians in the early 70s. The U.S. is lacking law and order, and we need to get that back. Why are we lacking law and order? Drugs. And so the war on drugs ensues. Now notice, a war on drugs. Now you have an enemy, you have to defeat the enemy, right? We have a drug problem today with opioids, right? What do we call it today? Healthcare crisis. Today we call it a healthcare crisis. You don't wage war on somebody who's sick. Back then, drugs was seen as the enemy, the users were enemies, and you had to wage a war. So it was a war on drugs, war on crime. If you go through the 1980s, by the early 1990s, we were kind of in a fever pitch in the US.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
Was the problem, the perception, users or sellers of drugs?
Both.
Both?
Both. And then it was decided that the sellers were, perhaps worse, in that we started with terms like drug kingpins. And we used these kinds of terms. The gangs that were involved, and this is where the early 1990s got involved. We were watching teenagers who were in gangs around drug activities. A phrase popped up of how to describe them. They were violent. Super predators. Super predators. And that actually came out of the Clinton administration. Hillary Clinton recently was criticized now for being part of that kind of phrasing. And so it was both, and we began to criminalize whether you're a user or seller. The seller's often more. Very quick, just to make the point, let me give you a story here. Several years ago, we had a guy in our program. He, at that time, had served 26 years. And I learned about his story. Here's how it goes. He comes up from the Dominican Republic legally. He plays baseball for a college in New York State. He gets injured, can't play anymore, drops out of college. Has somebody say, you should come to Michigan. So he does. Gets involved in the wrong crowd. Starts selling drugs. After being 9 months in Michigan, he gets caught. First offense ever in the U.S. No crimes before. What's he get caught for? He took 10 ounces of cocaine, gave it to a friend to sell. They caught the friend. The friend said, well, it's not even really my cocaine. Oh, whose is it? This guy. They charged him as a distributor. He ended up with 3 sentences, each one for a minimum of 20 years, that had to be served consecutively, not concurrently. So he got 60 years. Here he is, college age, first offense ever, and he got basically a 60-year sentence. Today, the same crime would get you 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years. So what's the difference? It's a war on drugs. And now we got to get the enemy, and you don't deal with the enemy, you destroy your enemy. And so and what they do is, even if they're willing to give that same crime today 3 to 5 years, it's not retroactive. They don't go back and say, well, maybe we goofed it, you should get that too. That stays. So this had a powerful impact in terms of now the increase in incarceration rates. In the US, you finally get the 3 strikes rule, right? 3 felonies, and then you're labeled a habitual offender, and you automatically get a life sentence. So if I've got 3 drug offenses that qualify each as a felony, and let's say I'm a user, I get 3, I get life for using drugs. In 1994, they also passed what was called the Truth in Sentencing Act. Apparently, we were told the public got sick and tired of people being sentenced to go to prison and then getting out early. So if I'm sentenced a minimum of 20 years but get out in 8 years, maybe because of good behavior, people were frustrated. Well, why'd you then sentence the person to 20? So the Truth in Sentencing Act said you have to serve your minimum. So now it doesn't matter for good behavior. If you got sentenced 20 minimum, you're going to serve 20. In Michigan, the way this might work, if I get sentenced for minimum 20, maximum 40, under Truth in Sentencing, I know I'll serve the 20. Now the state could let me go though at 20. In Michigan, for decades, prisoners would start serving 125% of their sentence. Even though you could be let go at 20 years, Michigan kept people longer with no apparent reason given. And so most people would not get out at their minimum. And so in the kind of prison system world, guys would often talk about, boy, I sure wish if I was selling drugs between, say, Michigan and Ohio, I wish I would have been caught in Ohio. But I got caught in Michigan. So, because in Ohio, I just would have served the minimum, but now I got to serve more just because Michigan had harsher sentencing laws.
In the past, haven't presidents of the United States issued pardons to these individuals that you've been speaking of who have had these long sentences?
They can. Absolutely they can, as a governor can. And so a commutation can be given by a president or a governor. The governor receives hundreds of commutation applications a year. And maybe a governor will give several. Part of the issue there, I think, is that it's become such a political issue for us, incarceration, crime. Politicians are nervous about giving somebody a second chance. Because now, if I'm a governor and I commute somebody and that person commits a crime again, right? Do you remember Dukakis? Willie Horton. Remember Dukakis? The ad was that when he was governor of Massachusetts, he did commute a guy. The guy gets out and he kills somebody. So when he was running against George W. Bush, or George H. Bush, the TV commercial was of an African-American man in a revolving turnstile. You go to prison, you get out under Dukakis. You go to prison, you get out under Dukakis. Now he's running for president. But they were using that. If you vote for him, you're voting for crime and these predators. And who knows if it worked solely, but it certainly contributed, some would argue, to his loss with that. So mass incarceration, 1970s, 1980s, early 1990s, it almost peaks. Quickly for our talk here, given that we're talking about a higher ed program in prisons, Bill Clinton signed a bill that would no longer allow a prisoner to receive a federal Pell Grant. So Pell Grants are available to a student if you're at a certain economic low, and it's money given by the federal government. It differs each year. Right now it's about $6,300, $6,400 per year. And that allowed a prisoner too, prior to 1994, to take college or university classes. When that ended up with about only 5 programs for college in prisons in the whole country. There used to be dozens, and that went down to about 5. And now that is the legacy that a program like Calvin Prison Initiative is dealing with, because it wasn't until just several months ago that it was decided that prisoners could get Pell Grants again, starting in 2022. So that's how long now that's been impacting higher ed and prisons. All right. Most of the crimes people commit are drug-related, about 2/3 in the federal system, about half in our state system. And these are nonviolent drug crimes. All right, incarceration in Michigan. Back in 1973, 8,000 prisoners in Michigan. 1973, this is kind of where the start of mass incarceration is, about 1973, 8,000 prisoners. In 2006, Michigan has 52,000 prisoners. That's a huge, huge jump. It doesn't matter what we're looking at. If we're talking about, you know, bumblebees, it's a big jump, statistically. Today, 2019, updated, we're about 37,000 and maybe 500 or so. So it's definitely dropping, and that's intentional, meaning this. More and more states want to depopulate their prisons, and it has mostly to do with finances. So Michigan right now is trying to depopulate its prisons, and so they're looking for guys to let out. And so we've actually had several guys in our program who were not supposed to get out, according to their sentence. Parole boards were letting them out. And we're going to see more of that in Michigan. So right now, the talk is they want to close 2 prisons in the coming year or so. And these, a prison in Michigan on average holds about 1,000 inmates. So that's a significant drop. If they do that, you're going to see it drop dramatically. But it's not necessarily because they feel guys are fully rehabilitated. It's not that as much as driving is the dollar. They simply can't afford it. They cannot afford it anymore. Why? From 1973 to 2006, the cost of incarceration in Michigan rose nearly 5,000%. Put it in perspective. Today, incarceration costs Michigan per year 20% of its general fund. It's 1/5 of its operating budget annually, or $2 billion a year.
You could fix a lot of roads for that.
Well, funny you should say that. So you took my next line.
Let's leave it in there.
No. Here's my next line. So, how are the roads in Michigan?
Yeah.
And we all go, boo. And then I say, guess what? We're going to spend $2 billion a year on our roads. 1/5 of the budget. We're going to fix those roads, right? And you say, great. And then we meet up 6 months from now, and you say, you know, I heard you say that, but guess what? That pothole in front of the house is still there. You would wonder, so what am I getting for $2 billion a year? Well, you're spending $2 billion a year on incarceration. What are you getting? And we don't know. We don't know. If I said, is it working? You'd say, I don't know. Are we lowering costs? You'd say, I don't know. Now, you ever heard the term recidivism? It's the rate at which somebody gets out of prison and goes back to prison within 3 to 5 years. The national recidivism rate is about 70%. If you ask the Department of Corrections in Michigan, what is it? They'll say it's 30%. But, remember earlier, who's connected to the incarceral system? You have to count jails, probation, parole. They're saying 30%, which means in their mind that only 30% literally go back and serve a prison sentence. They're not included in that who goes to jail for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, who gets their parole extended, whose probation gets extended. Why? If they include that, what the recidivism rate goes what? Way up. So it looks much better to have a very conservative definition of recidivism, which is to say you literally went back to prison.
Is recidivism as great in the other countries that you were doing the comparison on?
It's much, 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 much lower.
Lower.
extremely lower. Yes, sir.
So when you quote 70% for the other states, do they measure it the same way?
If yes, so no state actually wants to have a big umbrella. If they talk about recidivism, they want to literally talk about who went back and served a prison sentence.
So Michigan's 30 is lower than, much lower than the national average.
Yes, because the national average is looking at anybody, once released, who has any further contact with the incarceral system.
So they have a different definition.
Yes. So they're not telling us who gets arrested again. Why? Because you didn't call your parole officer on time. Who spends 10 days in jail because you maybe violated some minor thing on your parole. So they're not counting that. But that gets counted in the cost. See? So if we're spending $2 billion, what are we getting? And they'll say, well, we're lowering recidivism. And then I say, then why are we still paying $2 billion? You would think the cost would start going down. What gives? And because they don't want to incorporate all those other things, because it just looks bad, right?
I was wondering when you were talking about the number of prisoners who are out, if we are increasing the number of parole officers.
No. So right now, there is a shortage of employees for the Michigan Department of Corrections. It's so severe that they are having to use what they call non-custody staff. Now, that literally could be a secretary. It could be somebody who works in the kitchen. It could be a mechanic. They're using non-custody staff in custody positions. So in other words, they're taking someone who's been not trained to be an officer, using them temporarily as an officer because there's such a huge shortage of employees for the department. Your average parole officer has at least 50 people on his or her list at any given time. So again, it's worse than you thought. And yet we're still paying a huge dollar. And so that's why I say, I don't think people know, right? And again, you can see why the department and others wouldn't always want all this to get out there, because it doesn't look good. But we're paying a whole lot of money for incarceration, and yet there are some very significant problems in the system. No, I'm not trying to blame the people who run the system. I mean, it's gotten to a point of mass incarceration. And when anything gets so big, it gets unwieldy. And people, frankly, back in the early 80s weren't thinking through what it meant to sentence an 18 or 17-year-old to life. Or to 20 years, or 40 years. So I just had a guy get out several years ago. He committed murder at 15, was charged as an adult, given a life sentence, natural life sentence, and he was sent to an adult prison at 15. He finally got out. The parole board let him out. He had served 36 years and got out at 51. He never even washed his laundry. Not as a 15-year-old, and you don't wash your own laundry in prison. He had never had a job, never had a license, never went to driver's ed, never even washed his own laundry. And so nobody thought through, well, if I give a 50-year-old life sentence and he just so happens to get out at 51, now what? Now what? Frankly, if he hadn't had the Calvin community to do everything to help him acclimate, you can imagine now, well, what's he eventually going to do? Probably commit a crime, right?
How often are these people dealing with, they want to go back and live with their families, but because their families live in subsidized housing, they cannot live with their own families?
There are those issues, and quite often they're told they can't live back with their families given the conditions that led to their crime in the first place. And so...
subsidized housing will bar people.
It absolutely will bar
from
people.
Even consideration,
It absolutely.
regardless of what their situation is.
So we had another guy get out, and he eventually had saved up enough money, had a job, he was ready to get his own apartment, and he couldn't find one because every time on the application, have you ever committed a felony, he had to check the box. And immediately they would say, sorry, it filled already. Same with jobs. And so the minute, a lot of employers legally can deny employment to a felon. So there are these problems, and there's problems about even going back to their own community. That's often not a good idea. Sometimes they're not wanted, sometimes it's just not a good environment for them to go back to.
Do you have any really hard numbers on that? Because I was just mentioning this table, when 2008 came along and all the engineers lost their job, and I happened to be an engineer and an MBA, and
Yeah.
I went back for, pre-med. And,
Yeah.
I'm like, what does it take, 4 degrees to get a job at,
Yeah.
40 to 50? It's hard enough
Right.
with somebody that doesn't have that background. So what is the government really doing for anybody that's in middle age? Because really, as I looked into it further, there's great programs as you're graduating from college and then getting into a program, and then you go up. And if you want to go to 30 years, I had
Sure.
something at Ford.
Yep.
But if you want to go to 30 years, then it's okay. It's a little better now because you can work online, and these
Sure.
people, if they actually want to work, should learn IT, because that's about the only thing where they don't see you and need the jobs and get it done.
Right.
But, and thank goodness for COVID for that. That's the only thing that came
Yep.
out good. But the rest of it, for the last 20 years, they really haven't been
Sure.
handling this well.
So in
For
Michigan.
people that have multiple degrees
Mhm.
and good ones.
So in Michigan, if I get 10 years or 20 years or whatever I get, the programming for employment kicks in your last 2 years of the time you will serve. So take a 20-year minimum. That means I gotta serve 18 years before now I'm eligible for employment programming, because then I've got 2 years, what they say, to the door. And the biggest programs for employment in the Michigan system right now are the trades. Carpentry, plumbing, electrical work. Now, that's not all bad, it's good, needed actually. But, I don't know, again, let's think we have 31 people here. If I said to you, you can have a job, but it's gotta be as a carpenter. It's like, well, I don't wanna be a carpenter.
You have to be young to be a carpenter.
Or that, or I mean, yeah, maybe
Yeah,
be
it's a
good
little
at it.
different, maybe plumber a little bit.
So what's happening is the trades become the imagined job. You don't get that training until you're at least 2 years before you're out. And for those of us who watch this over and over again, it doesn't work. It doesn't work well. Why? Well, because what have you been doing for 18 years? And then all of a sudden in 2 years, you're supposedly going to get everything together and ready to get this job. But it's going to be limited to the trades. And then, of course, you have to have employers that are willing to hire felons. So even though you might be a skilled trades person, and there might be 20 companies out there that would be interested in you, not all 20 are going to hire a felon. So that number itself might drop down to maybe 4 or 3. Well, then you're still competing with anybody else who hasn't been locked up in the trades. So the competition, the kind of chance you're going to get that job is much, much slimmer.
They also pay
Then-
well. Those skilled trade pays better than having a bachelor's degree. So that's not something you're saying either, but it does. So skilled workers get paid a lot, and also carpenters have to be young. So you're sitting here at 40 to 50 years old in jail, what can you get? I mean, IT is still available.
Sure.
but- And that is 50% of the job, so I don't know why they're not steering them that way.
Dr. Chaffee, this is great discussion, but I know you have some amazing things to say
Yes.
about your prison initiative. Love to get to that, please.
Yep. No, we will.
You depressed us with the brief picture. Now, raise us up.
Yeah, no.
I don't know what they're doing.
We will, but again, I want to make sure quickly that you understand, though, what we're looking at. Just because rarely are you given that opportunity. For instance, 54% of prisoners in Michigan have someone under 18. Have children under 18. We know that incarceration rates is a connection to generations. if I have an incarcerated parent, I'm 50% more likely to go to jail myself. Right? Over the past decade, the number of prisoners who are 17 or younger is half of the prison population. Half. So we're incarcerating people that we would call teenagers in adult prisons, over half. Approximately 20% of Michigan's prisoners have significant mental illness, 1/5. And so if you say, what is mass incarceration? It's a much bigger umbrella even than just people who commit crime. So we see a correlation between the depopulation of mental health institutions and an increase in prison populations. There is a correlation. All right. Whew. Some good news. Given all that, once a few people at Calvin Seminary really began to understand what's happening in Michigan, as they say, it became a no-brainer. The gospel calls us to visit prisoners. Some key gospel people had been prisoners, like Paul. So all of a sudden, they said, my goodness, how could this not be a task for us, given who we are as a Christian institution? And so Calvin Seminary got very interested first. They reached out to then Calvin College, and they wanted to partner with us because they said most prisoners at best have a GED, and we're a graduate school, we can't offer them graduate degrees. How about we partner with Calvin College? Calvin College offers the BA. So when it came time to, well, what's the vision? It's literally the vision of now Calvin University. If you come to Calvin University and you ask us, what do we hope to accomplish with our students? We would say, we want to equip students to think deeply, act justly, live wholeheartedly as Christ's agents of renewal in the world. And so we take that same mission and use it inside the prison. And I have to admit, these guys go gaga over this. They love this. Many of them didn't even know they could think deeply, let alone to be asked to do it. To act justly, they like that one, but to live wholeheartedly. So I would say easily 85% of our guys who are in the program never, ever, ever dreamed of college. It just didn't happen. So we have a guy who just graduated in May. Every summer we have a picnic for friends and family of our CPI students. And we hold it on the campus of Calvin Seminary. And we easily get 100, 150 friends and family come out for that. A couple of years ago, the aunt of this guy that I'm referring to, she came and we presented where we're at with the program and what we're hoping yet to accomplish. And during Q&A, she said, hey, I've got a comment. She said, you know, in my family, as far as I can remember my family, cousins, aunts, uncles, you name it, every male has either been to prison or is in prison. And then she said, I don't know anybody in my family who's ever gone to college. And then she started to cry. She said, my nephew, yes, he's in prison, but he's going to college. And he is going to get a BA. And he has 2 kids. And now we're telling them, you can be like Dad and go to college. And
Not
so
in
you
jail.
can, what?
Hopefully not in jail.
No, yeah. But you can begin to see on the face of these folks when it's like, this was never a world that would open up to me. It wasn't there. And now, I have a little glimpse. And it literally makes all the difference. Because then you see this kind of glimmer of hope. You see a breaking of a cycle, right? So the mission is no different. Now let me add this. In every way we can, we want a prisoner to have the Calvin experience. So, we issue them a Calvin ID card that they can't use. But they can't believe it. they've got a college ID card. And it's not a prison card. We give them Calvin swag. Little pen with Calvin on it. Little this with Calvin on it. And they love it. And when they get their diploma, it says nothing about prison. It's simply a Calvin degree. And so this makes all the difference to them. In fact, when we started, the warden understood this, that when you go to college or university, you get enculturated, right? And you become one of them. And you root for the team, whatever you do. He said, you know, I had that experience when I was in college. Here's what I'm going to do. Around the cell door of each Calvin student, I'm going to paint the colors maroon and gold, just like Calvin. And so they go in, and they go into their cell, and their cell has maroon and gold. And then they wanted a pool table, and they said, could you donate a pool table for the day room where guys can relax? And they said, sure. I said, sure. And then somebody said, you should put the Calvin emblem on the felt. I said, it's brilliant. So that's what I did. And so now they play pool on a Calvin pool table. See, and this begins to offer a whole nother way of seeing their lives. A whole different way of narrating their lives, interpreting their lives. Huge impact. Now, there's more stories here, and I certainly will talk more about our students, but I've got a little short video clip. It's about 3.5 minutes. And if I have a chance to let you hear CPI students, that's what I like. So I want you to experience them in their own words. And we're hoping this will...
We hope it works.
We hope it works.
We don't know.
That's time.
This program has changed my life. It's given me an opportunity to be the person I feel like I was always meant to be. Calvin Prison is something that's becoming almost non-existent for an institution to come here and offer a fully accredited bachelor's degree. It's unbelievable. When I initially heard about the CPI program, I was elated who gets an opportunity to get a second chance. When I did my master's, I did a thesis work on how education reduces facilities. That's what made me actually pursue trying to get Calvin to get up and run the facility. The Calvin Prison Initiative for me was a no-brainer. Jesus himself told us to take care of the prisoners. I mean, where do you get any higher authority and higher instruction than that?
Those partnerships are absolutely essential, critical to our success as a department and our ability to help create successful people. Just seeing their commitment to learning and not getting grades, but their commitment to learning is just, it's one of those things when I leave it, say, thank you, God.
For someone who believes in empowerment to different franchise, this is sort of the best context for the company experience. The reason we do what we do is the right thing to do. This is what we believe Christ calls us to do. It's a living illustration of our own life. In our sin, we are without hope. And yet, God, out of His abundant grace and love, comes to us anyway. What I have learned is immense compared to what I may have given. This has been some of the most fulfilling dimensions of my life. We all want second opportunity, second chance. For me, that might not be freedom, but I have a second chance to do something that my life is still coming. Every person has a potential to affect, as Kyes Paul said, God's or Christ every square inch. So we might not be able to change a lot of things, but there's a sphere of influence that each one of us has. Calvin College coming into Hamlin campus, bringing in the CPI program, has been such a tremendous blessing in my life. One that I will be forever grateful for. One that I will be paying forward the rest of my life.
One thing I hope you noticed, Calvin Nights, the tables, we had them built, wood tables in the Calvin colors stained. We wanted to do everything we could to transport them, if you will, onto our campus, to where all of a sudden they can begin to realize they're created by God, God's image, they have a calling, they have purpose and meaning in life, and that we're there to help facilitate that. And so the last guy who was commenting, Dustin, this has been all new to him. He hasn't had a lot of people speak this way to him before. He hasn't had a lot of people kind of encourage him to have that kind of vision for his life. And so we really do want to kind of recreate that culture so that that can happen. Now quickly, the history. This was years ago now, over a decade. There were several professors from Calvin Seminary that had an opportunity to go to Louisiana State Penitentiary, which is often called Angola. And so that's a prison, kind of famous, infamous, if you will. Largest penitentiary in the country, 6,200 prisoners. It's the size of Manhattan. That's how big the place is. It used to carry the title of the bloodiest prison in America. And it lived up to that. Well, back in the mid-90s, they got a new warden, Burl Cain, who was not in a career of corrections. He actually was a high school teacher who got involved in education in prisons and then was appointed the new warden. And he was given this charge, change Angola. Well, how do you change Angola? The only thing he said he knew how to do was to educate, so he said that must be it. So he invited New Orleans Baptist Seminary to come in. Angola had a thriving church behind bars there. They have 30 churches that are run by prisoners, and that's been the tradition for decades. So he said, well, let me get a seminary in here and give these guys a seminary education. So that's what he did. And guys started graduating with Master of Divinity degrees. And they did the Hebrew, the Greek, the Bible, the theology, pastoral care, the whole bit. They would get their MDiv. Sometimes they'd get ordained. They had one guy, the Southern Baptist Convention wanted to ordain him. So the warden let him go in a car with 2 officers to a church, get ordained in the church, and told the officers they can't go in the church. But he could stay, get ordained, and he could have the potluck afterwards. Then they got him back in the car. The officers took him back to the prison. On the way back, he said, hey, what do you say we stop at a gas station so I can get some treats to bring back into prison? They said, okay. So this was just completely different thinking. So here's this guy earning his MDiv in prison. He gets ordained by the Southern Baptist Convention. He is a Baptist preacher behind bars now, legit. He's a senior pastor in behind prison. He has associate pastors, there's elders, there's deacons, there's a church secretary, there's evangelists, the whole bit. You go to Angola, and in any given month, there'll be 450 worship services. And it touches every corner of the compound. And this went on for years and years. And the goal was that every housing unit should have a pastor. Every housing unit should have a pastor. And they kind of did it like a parish system. So the guys in this housing unit could join this church. And a guy could literally join it and get a certificate of membership. And now the pastor had his flock right there. And if there's a problem at 2 a.m., he could address it. If there's a problem at 10 a.m., he could address it. And literally, you began to see changes so dramatically. Violence dropped by 85%. 85%. And you say, what happened? Church happened. Church. Christians doing what Christians do. Building fellowship, building community, building love and care for one another, and raising people up in the Lord. And that made all the difference. So here are these Calvin Seminary profs seeing this, saying, my goodness, what if we could do that in Michigan? So they came back, got permission to to go to the Richard Handling facility in Ionia and began to offer non-accredited courses. One course of fall, spring, summer. Guys loved it. Took them all. But then, of course, if you're a student, what do you want? You want a degree. Can I get something for this? That's when the seminary said, well, a lot of you at best have a GED. We're a graduate institution, so no, we can't offer you that degree. That's when they partner with Calvin College. So now that partnership together offers a BA in faith and community leadership. And it has all the liberal arts courses, philosophy, literature, you name it. And then for the major, it has a lot of seminary courses, faith leadership. If you're not a Christian, you can still be in the program. We have Muslims and others. Then we ask and call on you to be a community leader. And we offer actually community leadership courses. And then everybody minors in social work. And so the goal is that upon graduation, after 5 years, a student will begin to discern his or her gifts, or his gifts in this case, skill set, interests. But then for those who are Christian, we say, what is God calling you to do? So I literally talk to guys who are serving life sentences and say, what is your calling? Now, if you get a life sentence in Michigan, it is common to think to yourself, life is over. And that's how a lot of guys approach it. Now to have somebody saying, even though you're incarcerated, what is your calling in life? What are you going to do? And that's new. And all of a sudden, these guys lighten up bright. And they realize that even though they're incarcerated, their life is not over. And they begin to want to serve, they do. So we have 3 areas that we work with guys. Ministry, academics, guys can be tutors, academic mentors, teachers, and then peer mentors, life skills. All the way from addiction counseling to what counts for the good life and how to achieve it, and maybe even working with guys who are going to get paroled. Upon graduation, we shape these guys into teams in those 3 areas, and then we'll send them out as teams into other facilities. And they will work with a prison administration either to enhance programming or start new programming. Other schools now are starting to get programs going. Hope College, Western Seminary, in Holland, Michigan, they're going to offer a program in a Muskegon prison. We're going to send a team of our guys out to aid that program. The goal is to have a team of Calvin grads in every prison in Michigan. There's 30 prisons in Michigan. So we want to have an impact on every prison. All right, I'm going to very quickly here, and then I want to tie into the theme I know that you're working on here as a church. So what is the kind of brass tacks impact this has? Well, the RAND Corporation did a meta-study years ago on the impact of higher ed programs in prisons, and here's what they found. If you get any education, higher education in prison, it lowers the likelihood of recidivism for you by 43%. Not a degree. Any higher ed in prison cuts recidivism almost half. If you get a BA, it drops under 13%. If you get a BA and an MA in prison, the recidivism rate is below 1%. Below 1%. So if you said, how do we solve this problem? Education. Give them a BA.
Totally with that. And
Give it an MA.
Because I mentioned it to you. There has to be more than that. There has to be government bringing them in, the infrastructure system.
There does.
One, and they have to be pointed to the certain age.
There does.
And they
But
have
at
done a
least
good
we
job
know.
of that in the last 20 years.
We know, though, that any amount of education is going to impact, even if they don't always find all the resources they need.
Yeah.
And so now the RAND Corporation said this. If they look at the costs of higher ed in prisons, for every dollar spent on higher ed in prisons, you save $4 to $5 in incarceration costs. So one, it works. and it makes financial sense. Now, if we were taking that $2 billion and putting a significant amount of it to education, ultimately, you're going to have a return where that $2 billion drops dramatically.
But if you didn't do just the education, you have a couple years of education, and then you go right to jobs. You know, you've got people like Zuckerberg, Gates, whatever, they admittedly, they have Harvard as their education, but it's not just education, it's also in knowing how to create jobs and putting people in the places for the right type of jobs to keep them employed.
So let me add this. You're right, it's not just education. There was an article that came out recently by a group of social scientists from Baylor University in Texas. And this team studied Angola and some other places. And here's the conclusion they came up with. They said the current prison system in the US, they want to compare it to what we would call a failed state. So think of when a government collapses, a failed state. They said that's really what we're looking at here. They said to be incarcerated today, whatever problems you bring with you into incarceration, they're enhanced tenfold by being incarcerated. So it's a failed state. Now, here's what their research showed over the course of 10 years. They say it is now clear, the data seems to show this, without a doubt, that religious programming in prison is by far the most successful program of anything offered. Now, why? Is it simply because of the message? It's part of it. Take Christianity, it's the proclamation of the gospel. Is it Christian education programs? Sure, that's part of it. That certainly helps. Rand Corporation showed it did. But here's what they point out. Religious programming is not simply information passing. If religious people reach out to other people, what do they want? They want to build relationships. They want to build community. And so what we've discovered, this rings true for us, what we've discovered with the Calvin program is we can give them the finest BA they can get, but you know what really works? Is building that relationship where they know we care, we respect them, we love them. And it goes back to that whole mission of Calvin. We're not simply passing information, we're building a way of life together. So here's how I like to describe the program. We are building a spiritual and moral community, and we're doing it by way of education. And that's what makes all the difference. Yes, sir?
You talked about a dramatic reduction in recidivism, but what about first-time incarceration?
Say a little more.
Has there been a change in first-time incarceration as these people go back to their communities and talk about the education?
Yes. Yeah, so again, that goes back to if I have an incarcerated parent, I'm 50% more likely to be incarcerated. What we're finding is this puts in motion. So at Calvin, we have what we call legacy scholarship. If you are a Calvin student and you have children, your children get a legacy scholarship. So these guys, their children get legacy scholarships, if they want. And so what do? They call home and say to their son or daughter, hey, guess what? So I just had a guy on Friday say, my son is in Connecticut. I want him to go to Calvin. Can you give this information, contact for my son, to somebody in enrollment? And I said, of course. And they'll do the whole thing that way.
You guys are breaking the cycle.
Yes, and you build that network, break the cycle.
That's a good one.
Now, lastly, every church I go to, what can we do? What can we do? I said this upstairs earlier. A retired chaplain for the California prison system a couple years ago figured out, did all the numbers, and said, if every church in the U.S. adopted one prisoner, one, we would solve the problem of mass incarceration. Because what you're doing is you are extending this fellowship and all that it means to you, right? And think of all the times where you've leaned on people or you've been there for somebody else. Think of all the times the pastors come to you and prayed with you, whatever the case. You're extending that fellowship of love and care, And that changes a person's life. And then if the guy gets out, he has somewhere to go. He has people who he knows, and he knows loves him, and there's a place. One person. So now we can talk about ways to do that. But if our churches in the U.S. made that commitment, this honestly is a problem we could mostly solve. I really believe that we could mostly solve this program. I bet it's time, isn't it? If, as a congregation, as folks here, you would want to have further conversation about maybe what you could do, I know that was mentioned, I would love to continue having that conversation. I think there are very practical ways you could be involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. An informative and also an inspiring presentation. If you feel led somehow to become in this ministry, to become a part of this ministry, talk to Pastor Angela, talk to Elder Bob in the back there, and we'll see if we can't make something happen here at the Kirk. Pastor Angela, I would ask if you would come forward and close us in prayer, and you may have one or two other things you'd like to say. She always does.
So thank you so much, Dr. Chaffee. That was so great. Such important information to know and to digest and to process and to talk about and pray over. So I really hope that you'll take this week to let the Spirit work within you, to see where the Spirit is guiding us as a church to participate and to be engaged in problem solving and doing God's work. I did want to mention that on November 14th, we have another, I know I talked about this last time, but we have another person coming who will be talking about the prison work. She's a volunteer chaplain, Presbyterian Outlook editor, Terry Ott. She'll be coming to talk about her upcoming book that she has written, being a prison chaplain, on top of everything else that she's doing. And so that's going to be a really enlightening talk as well. So this talk can continue 2 weeks later, and that is going to be in St. Andrew's room, because in this room there's going to be veterans luncheon going on at the same time. So if you're not a veteran and you can make it to the other one, I hope you can come. With that said, I think we're good. Anything else that I'm missing? Did I miss anything? We're good? Okay.
No, we're just, if you did want to have some information, is it a way to put it in the brochure, your Sunday brochure?
Oh, definitely, definitely.
Online?
Yes, yes.
Because I think the connection, you might think about it, and then you might think about it 3 weeks from now and say, well, maybe I will,
Yeah,
it'd be nice to have information.
I hope all of you get our weekly emails that get sent out on Fridays. If you don't, please come and talk to me, and I can definitely add your email address to that weekly email. All right, well, I'm going to ask Dr. Chaffee to pray for us, if that's okay.
Sure. Sure. Let's pray. We are grateful, Lord, for all that you have given us, for all the good gifts, including your Son, Jesus Christ. It is because of him that we are here, and in him and through him, we can be called his body. We can be called your church. And of course, Scripture teaches that to be your people, Christ's body, the church, the purpose is to give witness to the world of the good news. And so I pray that you would empower each person here, Holy Spirit, that in all ways and in all things, each person here can reflect the good news. And that together, this congregation can be a force for change, an agent of renewal in the world. And now I'm thinking particularly within Michigan's prisons. I have discovered blessing upon blessing in prisons. You have raised up people who know the lowest point in life, renewed them, and called them your own. And now they have new life. It doesn't get any better. And so with that inspiration, with that vision, I would ask that this congregation would go out and get inside Michigan's prisons and to see what you are doing and to partner with you. Bless these people. Bless all that they stand for and care about. Bless the fact that they've come out to this. They could be doing something else. And I ask all of this in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman.